There are moments when the hardest thing to swallow is not the low mark itself, but the calm face of someone who never seemed half as worn down as you were, and yet still ends up above you once again. You look at the paper in your hand, then at them, and somewhere between those two glances something cold settles inside you. A thought you do not want to name but know immediately. What if all that effort still never reached the part that mattered? As we have just seen, what truly unsettles a person is rarely the result on its own, but the moment effort starts to look meaningless in their own eyes. And from there, the wound slips off the page and sinks deeper into the part of the self that is now struggling not to collapse. If that feeling has ever stayed with you longer than the exam itself, stay with this to the end, because what may have been exhausting you is not studying alone, but the way you have quietly used it to keep yourself from breaking apart. From that point on, studying begins to mean something else. It is no longer just about opening a book, learning what needs to be learned and moving on. It becomes heavier than that, more private, more loaded. It begins to serve another purpose altogether, protecting the part of you that is cracking under the pressure of trying so hard and still not getting back what you thought effort was supposed to earn. Because after enough moments like that, people rarely feel only sadness. Sadness is merely the first layer. Beneath it comes confusion. Beneath confusion, wounded pride. And beneath that, in the quiet place most people do not admit even to themselves, there is a question that starts circling like poison. If I have already given this much and it still is not enough, then what exactly is wrong with me? That is when a grade stops being just a grade. It becomes a distorted mirror. One that does not merely reflect performance, but begins to alter the way you see yourself. A disappointing mark no longer says, "I did not do well enough." It quietly mutates into something harsher, "Perhaps I am not enough." And once someone begins to hear life in that language, everything becomes heavier. You are no longer studying simply to understand. You are studying so you do not have to feel how far behind you might be. You are studying so you do not have to sit still with the possibility that you are slipping. You are studying to preserve one last version of yourself you can still respect. The serious one, the disciplined one, the one who can at least say, "I am trying harder than most." That is why so many people do not remain at the desk, because their mind is still sharp. They remain because they cannot bear what it would mean to stand up. To stand up would mean having to face something far more painful than tiredness. It would mean admitting that you may have spent hours there and retained very little, that you may have touched pages, notes, colors, summaries, explanations, yet stayed strangely empty in the places that matter most. And for an ego trying to survive on the image of being determined, that truth can feel unbearable. So they stay with the stack of books. They stay with the notes growing thicker. They stay with the desk that slowly turns into a kind of socially acceptable punishment. They stay with the suffocating but familiar sensation of forcing themselves to continue. Not necessarily because it is working, but because in that moment it still gives them something they need even more than effectiveness, the feeling that they have not given up. It sounds noble when phrased that way, but if you look closely, it is also deeply sad. Because many long study sessions are not long because the person is still learning. They are long because the person is terrified of the silence that comes after stopping. That silence is dangerous. Once the noise of being busy fades, one brutal question starts to speak more clearly. Did I actually learn anything today, or did I simply perform the shape of effort until I felt less afraid? And once that question appears, people tend to react in the most familiar way possible. They increase the dosage. More hours, more material. Another rewrite, more tabs, more colored lines, another cup of coffee. Another evening cut away from ordinary life. They make the day denser, harder, tighter, as if enough pressure applied to the self must eventually produce a result. But this is the very point where studying begins to drift away from what it is meant to be. It stops being a process that makes the mind clearer. It becomes a ritual that softens shame, a ritual that bargains with panic. A ritual that allows the ego to whisper, "Look at me, I am still trying, so surely I am not a failure yet." And that is why so many diligent students suffer in ways nobody quite sees. They are not lazy, they are not weak, they are not short on willpower. They have simply spent too long using willpower as a bandage wrapped around a method that is quietly bleeding them dry. Because the cruel thing about an ineffective method is that it does not stop you immediately. It does something more deceptive. It gives you enough of the feeling of progress to keep you going, but not enough real progress to move you onto different ground. So you repeat, you cling, you drag yourself through one day after another, telling yourself that perhaps you only need a little more time, a little more sacrifice, a little more strain, and that phrase, a little more, has swallowed entire months of life from people who were serious all along, until somebody else appears, someone who does not look tragic, someone who is not visibly burnt out, someone who does not carry the exhausted drama of studying in every movement, and yet somehow they still score higher. That image hurts more deeply than people realize, because it does not merely provoke envy. It shakes the private philosophy you have been living by. If someone else can arrive without suffering the way you suffered, then what exactly was all that pain for? This is the moment the ego resists most fiercely. It does not want the answer. It wants to keep believing that you are on the right road, only not far enough down it yet. It wants to hold on to the beautiful story that the one who pays the greater price will one day be repaid more generously. It wants suffering to count as evidence of worth, because if that story falls apart, then a far more painful possibility has to be faced. Perhaps you were never losing because you lacked effort. Perhaps you were losing because your effort remained loyal to a way of studying that drained you faster than it built you. That is where the whole thing reaches down into identity, because most people do not grow up merely wanting success. They grow up wanting to believe they matter. For many, academic effort becomes one of the main places they try to prove it. Every extra hour, every late night, every time they push through fatigue is not just about marks. It is also serving a hidden need. I must be the sort of person who is worthy of a better future. So when the result does not come, the pain does not remain a simple "I have not done enough." It turns into something more intimate and far more dangerous. Maybe I am not enough. And once that feeling has been touched, people stop responding calmly. Some become addicted to busyness, some to perfection, some to exhaustion itself. They study until the edges of themselves blur, then call it discipline because that sounds cleaner than what it often is, a form of self-punishment made respectable. That is why some study sessions look admirable from the outside and feel almost unbearable from within. You are not still sitting there because your mind is sharp. You are sitting there because you cannot bear what would happen emotionally if you walked away. You are not turning another page because it is helping. You are turning it because if you stop, you may have to hear the voice inside asking, "What did you actually do today?" You are not opening one more resource because it is essential. You are opening it because its presence helps you believe you are still in the fight. And from there, something bitterly ironic happens. The more serious the student, the easier it becomes to get trapped in habits that look responsible, but never force the brain to change in any meaningful way. They review more than they retrieve. They organize more than they collide with uncertainty. They refine the appearance of the process more than they expose its weak points. They choose emotional safety over useful friction. And so the results remain cold, not because they are unintelligent, not because they lack ability, but because much of their energy is being burnt on shielding the ego from feeling inadequate, instead of turning knowledge into something that can actually survive pressure. This is where one distinction matters more than almost anything else. There is the feeling of studying, and there is real learning. The feeling of studying comes easily. A desk full of material, hours passing, tight shoulders, dry eyes, a notebook growing thicker. It all creates the sense that something substantial must be happening, but real learning is quieter and more ruthless. It begins when the notes are closed and you test what is still alive without support. It begins when weak spots are allowed to surface early. It begins when you tolerate the brief humiliation of not remembering in order to build something steadier later. It begins when you return to the parts you are tempted to avoid. Put simply, real learning often wounds the ego before it improves the result. And because it wounds the ego, many people avoid it without realizing they are doing so. They choose what feels less threatening in the present and pay for it with greater collapse later. But sooner or later, if someone becomes tired enough, hurt enough, sick enough of carrying around a version of themselves that is always braced and always tightening, another way of seeing begins to open. The question is no longer, am I trying hard enough? It becomes, where is my effort leaking away? It is no longer, do I have enough discipline? It becomes, what is that discipline actually being used for? It is no longer, how do I force more? It becomes, what do I need to stop doing if I do not want to keep eroding myself? That is where the first real light arrives, not as a sweet reassurance, not as a motivational slogan, as a sharper, almost uncomfortable kind of clarity. Perhaps all this time you were trying to care for your future in a deeply clumsy way. You genuinely wanted to move forward, but kept driving yourself through methods that filled your day with intensity rather than your mind with structure. Your effort was real. It was simply being spent in the wrong places. And once that is accepted, change finally has somewhere to live. You no longer need a study day to feel punishing before you trust it. You begin to accept shorter sessions that are clearer and more exact. You stop measuring progress by duration and start measuring it by what remains when the page is gone. You stop waiting until you feel ready before testing yourself. You test yourself to discover where you are still exposed. You stop treating mistakes as insults to your worth. You start treating them as the place where understanding can finally take root. You stop dragging yourself into the night just to prove that you are serious. You understand that some things only stay when the mind has rested enough to settle them into place. And perhaps most importantly of all, you stop using pain as proof that you deserve to succeed. That is the deepest turning point. Because once studying no longer has to act as emotional first aid for the ego, it can return to what it was always meant to be, a way of making you clearer, steadier, more precise. At that point, the desk no longer feels like a courtroom. It becomes a place where the road is adjusted. A disappointing result is no longer evidence that you are useless. It becomes information. A gap in understanding is no longer a source of humiliation. It becomes the place where the real work begins. And the person who once stung you most, the one who looked almost lazy and still scored well, no longer remains a thorn in your pride. They become a cold but necessary reminder. This system does not reward the person who exhausts themselves most. It rewards the person who manages to keep what matters. Understanding that does not erase the past, but it does allow you to stop humiliating yourself because of it. And sometimes that is the true turning point. Not the moment you suddenly become exceptional, but the moment you stop seeing yourself as a hard-working failure and start seeing yourself as someone finally lucid enough to change the way they move. There are lights that do not wipe out the night all at once, but they are enough to stop a person from walking in pure despair. And if you want to keep tracing these hidden layers of yourself a little further, Psypher will still be here, walking with you a little longer.